Hello everyone and welcome to our presentation on women in exile. I am Seery and I will be presenting Anna Seghers.
And my name is Róisin, Cremin, and I will be discussing the work of Mascha, Kaléko.
Okay, so just a little biography on Anna Seghers. So she was born in 1990 in Mainz, Germany. She was born into an Orthodox Jewish family. She worked for the auxiliary war services in World War I. She got degrees in history, art history, and then a doctorate in philosophy from the University of Heidelberg. In 1925, then she married Laszlo Radványi, who was a Hungarian. She had met him in the University of Heidelberg. In 1933, when Hitler was elected, they fled to Switzerland. So Seghers' time in exile. She worked for anti-fascist collective movement. She published essays in Free Germany magazines. In 1942, she published the novel The Seventh Cross. When she finally did flee from the country over to Mexico, she tried to get her mother and father over to her as well. However, she was not successful and her father actually died before she got to see him again. Then in 1944, she published another novel that she had written during her time in exile, which was Transit. So the books then, so The Seventh Cross and Transit, they're both novels on exiles during World War II. So The Seventh Cross is about 7 escapees from a concentration camp from Westhofen, which is a fictional concentration camp, but it was based on the real one of Osthofen. And basically the SS officers in the concentration camp had erected 7 crosses for the 7 escapees, and they went and they caught them one by one, and they put them up on the cross to scare all the other prisoners. But there was just one, the 7th, that was left empty, and it was Georg, who was the last escapee. He was shown lots of kindness by people during his exile, mostly women, but some men as well. He was given shelter and food. So then one of the quotes from The Seventh Cross, the English translation: "All this trouble, all this misfortune that had befallen another people had been caused by my people, for it was obvious that they had talked like me and whistled the same tunes. As I was walking to Clichy, where my old friends the Bonnets lived, I wondered whether the Bonnets would be sensible enough to understand that even though I was one of these people, I was still myself. I wondered whether they would take me in without identity papers." Sorry, that was actually from Transit. And I had lost it so completely that I didn't quite know what it was. I'd lost it so utterly in all that confusion that gradually I didn't even miss it very much anymore. But one of those faces from the past, I was certain, would remind me of what I was. So these are both quotes from the novel Transit. Transit is more a reflection on her time in exile. So it was about her journey of trying to flee the country and get to Mexico. In Transit, there's a lot to do with like the loss of identity, as the narrator of the story actually steals a man's identity in order to get passage and to be able to flee the country. And near kind of the end of the story, the narrator falls in love with the woman and does everything he can to make sure that she also gets passage. But in this novel, she portrays women kind of as like helpless, like she feels that they need a male to kind of provide for them and to keep them safe. And then Róisin, I'll give it to you.
Great, thank you. So, Mascha Kaléko was born in 1907 in Galicia, which is now Poland. She was of Jewish descent and she was married twice. Firstly to Saul Aaron Kaléko in 1928 and then to Kemjo Venaver. I could not find a date for this marriage. She was both an immigrant and a refugee twice, firstly in 1914 when her family fled poverty in Austria and settled momentarily in Frankfurt and then more permanently in Berlin. Kaléko became an immigrant and refugee again in 1938 during the Nazi regime. Kaléko and her second husband fled to America. So Kaléko in exile. Her poems reflect her experience in exile, as many are written with a Berlin dialect or dialogue, and convey a sense of uprootedness and alienation. Although Kaléko and her family struggled financially, they still experienced a rich cultural life in Greenwich Village. Kaléko wrote literary sketches for the German media, and these sketches were later compiled and published in 1917. One poem that stood out to me in particular was Inventor. I think I was struck mostly and particularly by the simple language used. It's quite effective, I think, also because it's so accessible to lots of people, and you know, it's quite direct in the language that it really gets the message across. One sentence in particular that really struck me was the mouth without word, especially coming from someone who's an author and language means so much to them. It's very poignant. I mean, without one's mother tongue, I can only imagine the alienation that one would feel, but especially so if you're an author and that is how words are how you express yourself and how you channel your struggles. Other works by Kaléko include Spaziergänge, Walking Tours, Hotbed of Genius, A Male Song, so to speak, and An Interview with Myself. So Zusagen ein Mehllied is another one that quite struck a chord with me. In particularly this stanza, I was quite struck by that Free Manhattan versus Prussia, and that she discussed this because it really conveys that one never forgets the trauma, while they might successfully escape it and now be in a safer environment. That trauma and that fear and that pain stays with you forever. Her poetry was rediscovered, particularly in Germany. Her poetry is an expression of life in exile. The feeling of longing for a place that felt like home is palpable throughout. Now we shall have a discussion about the authors collectively. So both authors, female authors, portray the experience of being in exile through their poetry and prose.
Seghers, she writes from the perspective of males mainly, and then when she does speak, or when she does write about women, she kind of shows weakness and the helplessness of them, and I feel like this is something that she kind of thought about herself, like that she probably felt a little bit helpless. Her husband, he was in a concentration camp, and she obviously had to look after her children, so she couldn't really fight for her country and do what she felt was right, because she had to look after her children. So I feel like when she does talk about the weakness and kind of the helplessness that women in these books, I feel like it's kind of a self-reflection of herself.
Kaléko then writes from her own point of view. I think this is particularly evident in her piece Interview with Myself. Something I found quite interesting and also courageous was the fact that in 1960, Kaléko was nominated for the Fontaine Prize for Literature. However, she declined the nomination when she learned a former member of the SS was in the jury. I find that a little bit disturbing that was even allowed, that such a person would be allowed in the jury. But I'm also struck by her courage as a woman to stand up for that and take a stand against it. When she was in America, Kaléko became the main breadwinner for her family, and she worked odd jobs such as some writing copy for advertisements. And again, I find this quite interesting that she was the breadwinner as a woman.
Especially
you know,
at
that
time, yeah.
Especially at the time, yeah.
Okay, and then how they dealt with exile. Do you want to go first, Róisin?
I think it's very evident through her poetry that exile had a very profound impact on her life, understandably, and she continued to write about it. And her what were they called, literary sketches, they were published in 1997, after she had passed away, that we're still hearing that voice of exile from her, and even in very recent times, and still to this day. But I find it interesting that they were published in 1997. It's still very, very it's still very relevant, unfortunately. But for sure, she dealt with exile through her work, and I do find it quite interesting that they're still being published, understandably. And I'm not surprised at all, because she's a wonderful writer. But yeah, I undoubtedly it shaped her writing. I don't. It's all about exile. So
yeah,
that
I think as well, like they both used writing as kind of an escape from what they were dealing with at the time. But
absolutely.
Kaléko, I think, uses it more of like a personal diary kind of.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Seghers, it's not fiction. Well, it is fiction, but it's based on true events. But she's not writing about herself directly. So yeah, I think that's interesting that it's just very different.
It is. it is very different. Something that I find interesting is the fact that, you know, Seghers, it's fiction, as you say, but I think that also takes a certain level of a different kind of vulnerability too, because, you know, you're when it is fiction, you're giving your experiences over to someone else in a way because it's characters now.
Yeah.
And then, you know, with Kaléko, it's her words, and she is being herself in what she's writing. She's not giving herself a different identity, and that is also really effective. So like they take different perspectives, but they're both like equally valuable and equally important to note.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Okay, is that everything? Have we covered everything? Have you said
I think
everything?
so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for listening. And have a lovely week.
Thank you.